I feel like Jesus converted more than Matthew that day. Mercy is a big action word for God. Hi everyone, Angelo here. I'm a creative and theologian, and it's the 10th Sunday in Ordinary Time. We are in chapter 9 of Matthew. And we tend to call this story the Call of Matthew, where Jesus was going on. This is after a whole long, fast-paced series of miracles and healings and all that. And Jesus is going on, and he sees, Matthew, and he's sitting there by the tax house. This translation has by the customs house. And Christ looks to Matthew and he says, "Follow me." So Matthew get up and follow him. And then they were having dinner. And same time as a set of tax collectors and just a general term, sinners, all of them came and they eating and liming with Jesus and the disciples. But the Pharisees see this and they ask the disciples, they didn't ask Jesus direct. Sorry. They ask the disciples, how come your teacher, how come your master does eat with these sinners and these traitors, these tax collectors? And then when Christ get to find out, he say, if you're not sick, then you don't need a doctor. So go and learn what these words mean. What I want is mercy, not sacrifice. And then the way the story ends is by saying, I didn't come to call sinners. I didn't come to call the virtuous. I came to call sinners. So like we would have mentioned just now, we tend to call this story the Call of Matthew. And it's easy to think that this is the same Matthew that wrote the Gospel of Matthew. And naming the Gospel Matthew is more meant to speak to, this Matthew's influence. But it's probably not the same Matthew. Mainly because around this part of Matthew's Gospel is super similar to Mark. And then of course, as you know, Matthew would have used a lot of material from Mark to write his own Gospel. So to say that this is Matthew himself writing about his own conversion, his own encounter moment, his own conversion, probably not. But he probably did inspire the community, meaning Matthew the disciple, would have inspired the community who then went on to write the Gospel of Matthew. But what we do know from the story is that Jesus called a tax collector named Matthew, and at some point he had dinner. Like Jesus and Matthew would have had dinner, plus in addition to a bunch of other sinners too. And really the word sinners, we could read it as the word outcasts. And if we take it in, Christ himself was an outcast of sorts. And he sought out people who were marginalized and restored their dignity and their places in community. So a lot is happening in this story, even though it's only like 4 or 5 verses. So I'm going to try and streamline all of it into one sentence. What I get from this story is that Christ is being a master teacher. And he's doing that by inspiring conversion with mercy. And as we know, conversion isn't about changing our religion. It's about turning our lives to move towards union with God. So it's about changing our evil ways rather than changing our religion. Especially because there are plenty of non-Christians who are more united with Christ than some Christians. Now let's remember, the Gospels aren't biographies. So all of the Gospels, including Matthew, are less about the personal life of Jesus and more about telling the story that Jesus is God. And all of them do that in their own ways. For Matthew, Christ is seen as a teacher greater than Moses. And beyond that, Christ is seen as the fulfillment of the law. The same law that guided Judaism for centuries before Jesus. the same law that the religious leaders had essentially an oligarchy on. So Christ sets out with his plan. I'm sure he had to have known Matthew and vice versa. Maybe not necessarily personally, but at least in passing. And as a teacher, Christ identified that Matthew might make a good follower. And clearly Matthew did have that call in his heart because he just got up and he followed Jesus. So I think it's like, for any teacher, we have to help our students identify what God wants them to do, especially the younger they are. And then, of course, with each student, it is different. Like when I was at the seminary in particular, the seminary, well, what we could now call the Theological Institute of the Seminary of St. John Vianney and the Uganda Martyrs, I would try and listen for which student might have theologian in them. Because, I mean, they're all studying theology, right? But as much as, I mean, anybody could do theology. Anyone can theologize. But not everyone is called to be professional theologian. Not everybody has the call of theologian in their heart and that vocation of theologian. But I have a special interest in doing what I can to get students to explore whether or not God put theologian in their heart. Which is partly the reason why I do, well, these reflections. Because I wouldn't know if there's something that I might reflect on that somebody else might hear, however they hear it. And then they might realize that maybe they might be called to do theology in a professional capacity. Yet, as much as marks and grades are one indicator of whether or not a person has a specific vocation, theologian or anything really, I mean law or teaching, I mean any vocation or any call God put into our hearts to do, for us to spend our lives, well, giving ourselves to, giving our lives over to. As much as marks and grades are one indicator of that vocation, whatever that vocation might be, I think marks and grades are far from being the best indicators. And I say that because I have encountered people, as I am sure you have, who have so much to offer and who are so brilliant. But because they aren't good at school, they don't get the paper that basically certifies that basically says they are certified in what they are doing. And school is a skill. And test taking and paper writing is a skill. School isn't a one-size-fits-all system. And I say that because it's what I see in education. And I had 3 degrees. So I know what goes into learning a degree. And I understand how limited of a process that can often be for sometimes a lot of brilliant people. Thankfully, though, even though Jesus was a teacher, he didn't run some formal school to teach anybody. He only taught us one thing while he was here, and that was to love. Which is what we see happening in a major way today. Before we get into the love part, though, to look at one more thing Christ did by calling Matthew, I feel like Jesus converted more than Matthew that day. Meaning, I'm sure he touched a few sinners' souls enough to at least get them to think, at least think about how they could do better. Because as you already know, when it came to tax collectors in particular, they were seen as the worst of the worst. And it's because tax collectors were seen as traitors. They were traitors because they dealt up with Rome 1. But more than that, they shafted their people for their own gain. Meaning the tax collectors, their own selfish gain then. So what would happen is they would often charge people more than the people in them owed. And then of course, I mean, they wouldn't have, mostly people wouldn't have known back then, right? Because it's not like literacy was widespread the way it is now. So the tax collectors would charge the people who are paying taxes more than what they actually owed. And then they would give Rome their share of the taxes, and then they would keep the extra for themselves. So it's easy to understand why they were so hated. Because what they did was wrong, in no uncertain terms. It reminds me very much of our politicians in Trinidad and Tobago, which then becomes a challenge to me personally to learn the meaning of mercy. Because how I feel about politicians is how Christ's people would have felt about tax collectors. And I'm not saying they don't have good, hard-working politicians. I am very sure they do. It's just very hard to identify who they are. But just like Matthew, God put a vocation in each of their hearts. And even though so many of them might sell out the country, perhaps waking up their God-given vocation, whatever that might be, could inspire them to turn from their wicked ways and to do good for the nation. And we have to hold out hope for that while seeking justice. So same way Christ called Matthew, and Matthew's friends and peers at the very least come around to align with Jesus. Same way I feel like when it comes to education in particular, I feel like inspiring what we might call the troublemaker of a class then. I feel like inspiring them could totally transform the ethos of a class. And I use the term troublemaker as a conventional term for this reflection, since most of us could automatically picture a student when we say troublemaker. I don't think we should be addressing students as troublemakers, especially the younger they are, since that might become the only identity that they know. And that isn't their identity, obviously. Because we don't need them to think that that is their identity. We don't need them to think that they are trouble. Because they're not. And then we don't need trouble. Because there's too much trouble right now. Too much people think their identity is trouble. So I use that term conventionally. But the thing is, a lot of times, as you would know, when children give in trouble, it's because they're acting out. It's not because they're inherently evil. It's because they're acting out or they're discharging some kind of pent-up energy or trauma. And we know the saying, birds of a feather flock together. So I raise all of this to say, if a teacher can inspire one person, like how Christ did with Matthew, then that one person could turn around and inspire others similar to them, like Matthew with his tax collector friends. And sometimes I have the privilege of seeing an approach like this work too, meaning trying extra with one student who needs extra love. And that works out to them changing, or at least taking these steps too. And it turns into them talking to their friends too. Which, I mean, for me at that point, I feel like I can ask for more. Because what it shows is that proper learning took place. A student can't talk about or practice something that they don't know unless they at least have a working understanding of it. Same thing when it comes to morals and values too. So this old West Indian mentality about do as I say and not as I do, as much as we have always known it, that can't work. So as much as we call this story the call of Matthew, I don't doubt Matthew plus more were called that day. And they were called because Jesus showed them love. He showed them mercy, and mercy opened their hearts to him. And he tells all of us too, coming on to the end of the story, because of course we know the Gospels are written for us. Because again, they're not biographies, they're telling the story of God. So Jesus calls all of us too, coming on to the end of the story, to go and learn the meaning of the words mercy, not sacrifice. The proverb isn't just meant to be a profound proposition. When we learn the meaning of mercy in particular, it carries practical implications. And I say that because I remember once doing a whole paper on mercy in Judaism. And trust and believe, mercy is a big action word for God. The amount of discourse it had among the sources I would have looked at when I was doing my research. And that's just the Jewish perspective. I didn't get into Christianity. But long story short, mercy is meant to be this infinite, covenantal love. This unwavering commitment to show a person compassion. I would recommend exploring the etymology of two Hebrew words in particular. Rahamim, which I believe is the more direct English, the word mercy or compassion is the more direct translation of Rahamim. And then there's the other word, Hesed, where that might translate to, it's two English words, it's just put together, it's not really a word. But the word, how we come to understand or translate as loving kindness, or the same thing that we're talking about, that covenantal love, this unwavering commitment to love, that is how Hesed could be translated. And mercy, when you read for yourself, you'll see. But there's a big, big link between the two, Rahamim and Hesed. So I'd recommend exploring the etymology of those two words and to do what Christ say, to know the meaning of mercy, not sacrifice. Especially because when we know it, we can put it into practice. And how you practice mercy will look different to me. Overall, though, it's so ironic. The man who showed no mercy at all for probably the large majority of his life, he was shown mercy by Jesus. He was shown what mercy was by Jesus. Because maybe he didn't know what mercy was. And then he could then turn around and show mercy to others, especially to those most in need. But the teachers of the law, who should know and prioritize mercy, they showed none. Talking about the Pharisees in the story. So this story is the classic saying of Scripture, that the stone that was refused became the capstone. And that's why it's important for us to never write off anybody, even politicians. Because at the end of the day, God's call in a person's heart is enough to move them from being a traitor to being a teacher. And if that is not a sign of the power of Christianity, then I don't know what is. So on that note, whoever you deal with in your life, especially when it comes to dealing with young people, besides showing them mercy, I'd ask you to listen to your interactions with them. And if you do feel God might be calling them to something, then you could ask them. I mean, you don't impose it on them, don't force it on them, especially when it comes to speaking from the experience of every young male growing up in church, this idea about whether or not you have a vocation to the priesthood. Most of us, I don't spoken for, but I knew that wasn't my vocation. And I think I could safely say most Catholic young men are not called to the priesthood. A lot of them are, but most of us are not. So what I'm saying is don't impose when listening to your interactions with them. But simply ask, it doesn't have to be anything preachy. Just something as simple as, you ever thought about blank before? So if you're asking a young person, you ever thought about becoming a priest, or you ever thought about being a nun, or you ever thought about being a teacher, you ever thought about volunteering in this capacity? I mean, anything. You could really ask anything and just ask, have you ever thought about this? And hear what they had to say. Because once they think about it enough, once they think about it once, that is enough. If it is from God, it will come back up. And they won't be able to ignore it. Anyways, that's it from me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.